Podcasters. Podcasting Smarter is the official podcast from Podbean, featuring podcasting interviews, best practices, and helpful tips. We're here to give you the tools, resources, product updates, and news to help you get started podcasting and keep your podcast growing.
Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome. We are so excited to have you here today. Welcome to our July Storytelling Podcast Week live event. My name is Norma Jean Belenke, and I'm the head of events here at Podbean. And today we're joined by a really special guest, Clara Starr from the Your Sleep Guru podcast, an incredible sleep podcast. Just beautiful, beautiful audio. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to read our brief intro and then we'll jump right in.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, we're so excited and just to hear your story and more about the podcast, how it's come to be, what you've done with it. It's an amazing show and we're so excited to chat with you today.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, to Podbean's Storytelling Podcast Week and Podcasting Smarter Live series. This is our live event for July in conversation with Clara Starr, Unveiling the Magic of Your Sleep Guru podcast, featuring Clara Starr of the Your Sleep Guru podcast. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Storytelling Podcast Week has live stream sessions like this one with top podcasters and storytellers from scripted fiction and nonfiction podcasts from across our world and our imaginations. We also have exclusive recorded episodes on the Storytelling Podcast Week podcast. Storytelling Podcast Week is brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to over 640,000 podcasts. To start your podcast, head over to podbean.com today. And now we'll jump in. Hello, Clara. How's it going?
Good. How's it going with you?
Good. We're just so excited to chat with you today. So first off, for everybody out there who hasn't had an opportunity to listen, the link is here in the description of our event today, so you'll be able to check it out there. But Your Sleep Guru is an incredible podcast that helps people get to sleep, and it's sleep stories, and they're beautifully done with Clara's calm voice, and it's a spectacular show. So we're really excited to chat about that today and to talk about the show, how Clara makes it, and her journey of becoming a podcaster. So let's get into it. I want to hear about how you started the show and what inspired you to create Your Sleep Guru, and because you grew up in the countryside of England, which sounds idyllic. I'm not British, but how did your childhood and how did your influences create the podcast?
Well, it started off with me having severe sleep issues because I had been working in TV news during the night shift and early morning shift. And as a result, after 3 years, my circadian rhythm was really upset. So I started looking online for podcasts that were nature-based because whenever I'm in nature, I feel very relaxed. And nature really speaks to me the way no therapist could speak to me. When I go outside, I feel very relaxed and calm. And after doing some research, I found that nobody was really doing anything that was storytelling combined with nature. So I developed this podcast based on my experiences with nature growing up in England. And I grew up in this very beautiful part of the world called Suffolk. And it's on the east coast of England. And in those days when I grew up, it was very remote. And I was able to spend all my free time exploring the river that ran by our family home and exploring the marshes, getting lost in the woods, going to the beach, which was not too far away either. And intermingled with all this beautiful countryside was a lot of history. And I was very inspired by the fact that across the river from where I grew up was this place, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's called Sutton Hoo. No. And Sutton Hoo is one of the most famous archaeological sites in the whole world. And
Wow.
it's the burial site of an Anglo-Saxon king. And he was buried in this boat And when the people who were living on the land discovered it in the 20s, they uncovered all kinds of treasure, like swords that had jewels encrusted in them, and an incredible helmet that this king, they don't really know if he was a king or not, but he wore. And
Wow.
so I felt very fortunate to kind of grow up in this area that was steeped in this very unusual history.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I was also lucky enough to grow up near some castles too, that were 12th century castles. And that also inspired my love of storytelling as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like your childhood kind of had this, mystical quality, right? Where things from storybooks or from legends are kind of around you in a way that lends to creativity and
Yeah.
was really accessible. So that's incredible. Yeah, and it sounds like maybe, as a child, the imagination before the world kind of, steps in so much. There's so much more room, I think, for imagination and so to be in the countryside and to have this like archaeological site, right? Really lends itself to like, oh, and what stories might have happened here and that kind of thing. So
Yeah. And that wasn't the only story there, too. There's also another story that is called the Rendlesham UFO incident. And it's like, it's kind of like the English Roswell. And in the 80s, there were a couple of air bases in the area. And in the 80s, one night, the people who were patrolling this air base called Bentwaters Air Base discovered a UFO that was going through the forest. And they went to investigate, and it had landed in the woods. And when they went up to it, they discovered that it had strange kind of hieroglyphics on it. And as soon as they went up to it, it disappeared. And there were lights in the forest. And they were able to follow the lights through the forest. And they thought that maybe there were 3 or 4 UFOs flying through the forest there.
wow, yeah, it's something where I think, maybe there's a few things happening there that really kind of lended more to the imagination. That's incredible. And the creative process behind the podcast is really interesting because the stories are all individual and unique. So can you share your creative process in blending narrative storytelling and nature sounds, calming music to create the journey for your listeners?
Well, it starts off with an idea, and the idea can happen when I'm looking through a book, or if I'm out on a walk, or if I see a film that speaks to me in some way. And then usually I write the idea down because I'm afraid that it'll disappear, because I'm always getting ideas in my head.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then I'll think about it and allow it to sort of seep for a while, like a cup of tea or something when you're
Yeah, let it
brewing.
marinate in your brain.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, and then I start writing, and probably spend a couple of days writing it down. And then after I've written it, I will spend time rewriting it to get it so that it flows as a narrative and not as something that's a story. I try and make it like it's something that I'm speaking to rather than reading.
Yeah, because I mean, for podcasting especially, and I think a lot of podcasters encounter this, right? When maybe you have a script, or maybe you have a story you want to share, but you want to make sure that it doesn't sound like you're reading off a page, right?
Yes, yeah. And then I record, and then I take natural sounds from I subscribe to a library of sounds, and I try and match the sounds as precisely as I can to the place that I'm picturing in my imagination. And then I blend. I usually take a lot of time to edit because I feel like silence also plays a part and the pacing plays a part. So I spend a lot of time editing to make sure that it's just the right pace, because I don't want it to be too fast so that the listener doesn't get a sense that I'm trying for them to get, which is a relaxing sense.
Yeah, and you don't want them to feel rushed. I think also
Yeah.
because it's a sleep podcast, it's almost like about the pace of your voice as well.
Yes, that's true. And then I blend the fading in and fading out so it all flows. And usually this takes about 3 or 4 days of just listening, tweaking, listening again. It's a process.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have an episode out pretty much every week. So it's something where as half your week is spent creating an episode, just one, right? And so
Yeah.
it's something that's quite labor intensive when you think about it. And what's great about the show is that it's evergreen, so that if there's an episode you really like, you can listen to it all the time to fall asleep, or you can listen to a new one, every week, that kind of thing. But it's something where, so much work goes into it. And I think when you're listening, you're like, oh, I'm just going to put this on. I'm so excited. Or, oh, I want to go to sleep. And then to have you explain like how much work goes into it, right? I got an idea and then I wrote it down and then I wrote the story down and then I, worked on the narrative to make sure that it sounded right. And then I recorded and then I added nature sound. It really is a process. And I think a lot of podcasters, when they see podcast success or when they see a podcast that's been around for a good while, it's something where, it's so easy. But actually, there's just a lot of work that goes into it.
Yeah.
It's something that it's really important that we acknowledge. And thank you so much for breaking that down and for explaining it. Because it really is, in a way, an art form, right? There's technical aspects, there's creative aspects, but there's a lot of work there behind the scenes of just hitting play and listening to a great podcast as well. And you mentioned also that you subscribe to like a catalog of nature sounds. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that and selecting, the different sounds for each episode. Like, what's the name of the catalog?
Oh,
Is it
yeah.
something you subscribe to? I think a lot of other podcasters out there love to hear about resources. And so it's something where, anything you can tell us about how you blend those in as well would be really, really cool.
Well, I subscribe to this service called Envato Elements,
Mhm.
and they have a lot of sound samples that are nature sounds specifically. They also have video and photographs, which I also incorporate in my social media stuff that goes along with the podcast. So there's not just the work of putting the podcast together, there's also the promotion of the podcast as well.
Yeah.
And then there's another service called Pond 5, which I use a lot too. And yes, and usually I'm pretty lucky with the sound files, because sometimes I imagine these places that I've never been, and I have to do research to find out what kind of birds exist in those places, for instance. And so I have to find the sound that goes with the place. So there's a lot of research too involved in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing. I think it's something where, when you're thinking about, okay, where am I going to get these sounds? It's so important to make sure that you work like with Envato or the other provider you mentioned, because you want to make sure you have the rights to use the sounds. Number one, that's
Yeah.
such a big aspect of podcasting. And so it's really important. And once again, just the amount of research, right? Like, okay, I'm doing an episode about this specific place. What do the birds sound like from there, right? There's going to be different birds. There's going to be different nature sounds. So I think it is important to also bring yourself into that, because it helps create that immersive experience for the listener, which I think is so important as well. And you also mentioned promotion. So a lot of podcasters out there also, promotion is its own whole separate thing, right? And so, you mentioned also finding content and creating content that works symbiotically with your content of the podcast. So that works in conjunction and matches and pairs the audio content, so that maybe when people are seeing a social media post, they're going to see a visual of, hey, this is a beautiful place where I can hear the story, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's an important, well, I'm not sure that people know about this in terms of my podcast, but I feel like it's an important element of it because it's, for me, I'm a very visual person. So I think it's kind of cool to have a visual aid to go along with the podcast. So you
Yeah.
can, so the listener could see what I was trying to picture in my imagination when I was creating this sleep environment for them to visit in their imagination.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell us a little bit about your promotional strategy? Because the show's been doing incredibly well. It's a beautiful show. And I think for people out there who know the show maybe and are wondering, what it takes to build up an audience, can you talk us through a little bit of what you've created?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I use Instagram a lot.
Yeah.
Every day. I use stories, reels, posts. I started to use Pinterest a while ago because I think that's a really great, friendly platform,
Yeah.
and it has a lot of different applications. And now they have this thing for creators called idea pins, which allows you to put a series of video on like chapters. So, I can make a promotional piece that has 5 or 6 different parts to it so that the listener, if they're interested, can go and check out what I'm trying to get at with the visualization after they've woken up, or if they see the title before they go to sleep. The other thing I use is Headliner, which is a program that captures parts of the podcast and puts the audio against an icon, either an episode icon or something that you choose.
Hmm.
And this also has video element to it. So
Yeah.
if you wanted to, you could put video to that. And of course, there's my website, which I'm hosted by this company called Superpass, which I really love because when I joined them, the platform is not only a website platform, but it has an app to go along with it. So I'm able to not only have my podcast on the app, but I can also put courses there and have behind the scenes content as well. And I think that's about it in terms of my social media development.
That's quite a lot.
It's like full time. I'm thinking about ideas for podcasts that I'm going to make. I'm editing. I'm doing social media. It's just really a very time intensive thing that I'm involved in. I had no idea how much it would consume me when I started this in 2019.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely, it's definitely a full-time thing. And, in podcasting, just there's a lot of work that goes into it. So, I really appreciate you breaking down and sharing kind of what you do because, when you're seeing a podcast on Instagram or you're seeing a podcast on, online or you're seeing new episodes, you don't always know what goes into it. You don't always know what goes into cultivating and building an audience, right? How much they're thinking about, okay, this is my Pinterest strategy and this is how much energy I'm going to put into the Pinterest promotion and all that kind of stuff. So I think that it is something where, if you have the forethought to create a strategy and a plan, it can be really helpful so that you don't get overwhelmed. But there is a lot. There is a lot to do as well.
But I do love it because I'm a creative person, and this is just such a fabulous outlet for me because I have these ideas in my mind and I can just put them out there for people to enjoy the way I enjoy it in my mind.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the freedom and the creativity that podcasting offers. So it's really incredible to hear your story. And next, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that it's a sleep podcast because as a sleep podcast, right? You're there's also different aspects that other podcasts wouldn't engage in, right? Like in terms of relaxation, in terms of enhancing sleep quality, making people feel refreshed, but also, and I want to hear you speak to that in terms of the tone of your voice and how you craft the show. But also, the point is to help people fall asleep. So then you're not retaining the listener as well.
Yeah.
So there's also that aspect. So first off, can you tell us a little bit about, how you've created the show and in terms of making sure, that those feelings of relaxation are present?
Well, first of all, it's kind of complex because I have to provide a hook for people, and then it can't be that big of a hook that they're trying to see what happens at the end. So I guess the hook is in the title and then the beginning part of it. So my podcast is sort of like a hero's journey type of thing where there's something that is discovered at the end. So, for instance, a waterfall, somebody will be in a tropical rainforest and they will be going on this journey to discover the waterfall. Or one I just did was they discovered an amulet in the ground that was from Roman times. So that's the hook. And then I pace it so it's very slow. And I think the pacing is very important. A lot of silences so people can actively, but not actively, but engage their imaginations, because I think that part of a really good guided sleep story is having people engaged and having the time in their minds to see what I'm trying to describe to them. And when they get into this state in their imagination, I feel like it's almost a hypnotic thing because I'm using a very slow cadence.
Yeah.
They're using their imagination, and eventually they drift off to sleep. And I've often had listeners contact me and say, I fell right asleep and I don't know what happened. And I want to listen to it again because I want to see what happened in it. And to me, that's really wonderful because it means I've done my job. I've provided them something that they want to listen to and hear.
Yeah.
But I've also, above all, given them the gift of a peaceful night's sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something where, the way you're speaking about time and creating space is really important. And we've had a lot of other guests talk about this, about how podcasting is a participatory medium because, your audience isn't seeing what you're seeing. So they're going to create that in their mind, right? So, if you're talking about a story or a waterfall or an amulet, when everybody hears waterfall, they think maybe of a specific waterfall, right? Maybe that they've seen online or that they visited, something like that. Same with an amulet, right? They're thinking, it's a necklace with a gem, and then they're thinking about what the shape of it is and the texture of the chain. And so I think the human brain wants to complete those details, right? As, just how our brains work. And so podcasting really lends itself to allowing your listener to fill in the gaps. But sleep podcasts specifically, when you space things out and you create that restful space, I think it allows people's brains to kind of also settle in as well, which is really beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very cool. And I want to ask you next because the soothing and calming nature of the podcast is so special. And like you mentioned, the engagement is great because people have that thing at the end they want to discover. They fall asleep. They're going to listen again. And so, I want to ask you in terms of creating the episodes, do you think about that when you're creating them? I mean, are you thinking like, okay, this is where maybe someone will fall asleep, or do you think, okay, I'm just going to, continue through the episode to the end? And obviously things kind of like you said, a lot of the information's at the beginning, and then there is this narrative journey, like a hero's journey. So, I mean, in terms of you creating the podcast, are there any markers that you have, or is it just kind of continually through the episode?
Well, I structure it so that the beginning is the little hook. Then I have a really, really simple relaxation exercise that's either a body scan or a breathing exercise. And then I go into I guess it's like an adventure. And as I go along through the journey into sleep, I really slow it down. So my cadence may start off quite fast, but then it progressively gets slower, but not too slow. So I guess about 3/4 of the way through, I maybe my voice may start getting a little bit lower and softer, and it'll become slower. And hopefully that's the right formula for certain people, to fall asleep. But I also think that the sound is very important. I incorporate this natural sound, which naturally lends itself to people feeling relaxed. I think almost everybody could say that nature is a good thing.
Yeah.
Being outside, they feel that. And I'm hoping to provide that natural sensation in their imagination that they get when they're outside, in their imagination, when they're listening to what I do.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, like you said, maybe 3/4 of the way through, you're slowing down. Maybe your voice is getting a little bit more calm. It already is so soothing and calm. Yeah, and incorporating those elements of nature. I think you're right. When people are in nature, there is like a relaxation. So
Yeah. And it's been proved, they've done studies that have proved that nature slows your heartbeat down. It releases chemicals in your body that are conducive to your relaxing, and that it's good all around for your memory, your blood pressure, everything. So nature's really the key in all this.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to kind of pivot a little bit, and you had mentioned social media and what you do to promote the podcast. And in terms of growing your audience and attracting new listeners to your sleep guru, what have you found to be the most effective? And yeah, we'll start there.
Well, I feel like every day I'm just putting as much visual content out there and hoping that I will capture someone's attention. I don't really have a strategy. It's just trying to provide quality visual content and to go in hand with what I do, which is the best I can do in terms of podcasting. So I don't really have a strategy. I'm always trying to compete against myself, I guess, to create content that's better than the last content that I've made. So I guess every day I'm raising the bar for myself. So I guess that's my strategy, trying to compete against myself.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And as a podcaster, we all evolve, right? So it's something where, and I've talked about this at length with quite a few guests. If you ask any podcaster to go back and listen to their first episode, they're like, "Oh no, I'm fine."
Yeah, I feel that way.
Yeah, and so I think it's something where, you just have to do it, right? There's no perfection on day one.
Right.
Almost any podcaster will tell you, I absolutely can't stand it. Don't make me listen to the first episode. You can't pay me to do it.
Yeah.
So I think it's something where, in terms of our audience, in terms of our podcasting ability, in terms of, building up that strength and those skills, you only get better by doing it. So that's a really important aspect as well.
And consistency, I guess,
Yeah.
consistency. And I love engaging with people who comment on my show. I find that very, very exciting when somebody, even if it's a bad review, I haven't had many, but I just love it because even the negative stuff helps me. And of course, the positive stuff just makes it all worthwhile because anybody who's in the podcasting world knows that it's a tough road to travel on.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really important aspect as well. Community is a really big part of podcasting, right?
Yeah.
And you know, it's really easy to think like, oh, it's me and the mic, and I'm in a void, and I'm just here in this bubble. But I don't think that's true because as podcasters, you're putting out things into the world, and there is a community that's going to respond and communicate with you by listening, by interacting with content, by reviewing and rating episodes. So I think that that's a really important aspect as well. And like you said, engaging with that community is really important. And, for people out there, I'm sure we've all experienced this too, when a podcast you like, you comment on their Instagram post or their new episode, you know, and they say thank you, or they like it back, or they start a discourse with you. It means a lot. That's
It
something
really
that,
does.
yeah, that's something that you really love as a listener as well. So I think that engagement is a really large part of it. And the fact that you're so engaged with your listeners and your community as well, I think is an important aspect. Yeah. Well, I want to talk next about helping people reach this deep state of relaxation, which we kind of touched on. But in the podcast, you have some really effective ways to incorporate meditation, like you mentioned, body scans, maybe a breathing exercise, and visualization techniques. So I guess I'm wondering, like, have you studied meditation in terms of, creating this sense of deep relaxation? Because the podcast is incredible. It's, you really just zonk out. So it's something where, in terms of creating that state, like, I don't think you have a formula, but what contributes to that?
Oh, I guess, well, I've studied yoga for a long time. So I guess I've always been really interested in yoga as a way to relax. I've always been interested in meditating as a way to calm myself. I suffer from incredible anxiety, so I've always gone towards yoga as and meditation as a way to relax. So I guess I try and incorporate the things that I've learned myself help me into the podcast. And as I've said, nature plays a huge role. The way I've experienced nature is very important for me to try and share with people who are stressed out, because I think meditation and nature as a formula is like it's a winning formula for people, because they're both just what it's all about.
Yeah, I think that there's a slowing down and getting back to a natural pace, right? The pace the plants grow, the pace of our breath, that kind of thing. So it makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. Yeah. And just kind of, I think the world feels like it's getting faster and faster for a lot
Yeah.
of people with social media, with, now in the world of AI and the internet, obviously. But I think with smartphones, it's something where getting back to that pace of that human pace is really important as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And storytelling also is very powerful. And I feel like podcasting is a great way to help people disconnect from all that crazy stuff that's going on out there in terms of technology.
Yeah. And taking a break.
Although it's kind of ironic because you need to have technology in order to listen to a podcast that I make or that anyone makes. So it's sort of like a double-edged sword.
Yeah. Or it's a way maybe that we can use the technology to bring that sense of peace and calm and bring people back to that human pace. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
And I want to talk to you a little bit next about the genre of sleep podcasts, because it's definitely an interesting genre to be part of, right? There's so many different podcasts out there within sleep stories, meditations, and it seems to be kind of ever evolving, which is really interesting, right? Like all of the different podcasters, like your podcast that is evolving from the journey of your first episode to now. Can you tell us a little bit about the genre of sleep podcasts as well?
I'm just surprised how many different podcasts are out there that people can listen to for sleep and apps. And now they have an app. I'm not sure what it is, but I read about it. I can't remember the name, where you can kind of tailor your own ideal sleep technique. So you could blend things like AMSR and storytelling, or nature sounds and storytelling, or just straight sound. There are just so many sleep podcasts out there, and I haven't listened to many of them, but I know that there are a lot of really good ones out there.
Yeah, it's an interesting genre of podcast because it's, like we mentioned before, sleep podcasts are designed for you not to listen to the end of the episode, right? So
Yeah.
there's that aspect, but then you would think like, oh, I'm going to put this on, I'm going to totally fall asleep. But there's so much creativity and variety. I mean, within your Sleep Guru, there's a different story every week, and it's like a beautiful narrative that takes you on a journey. And then there's different sound elements, and your voice is so calm, and like we've spoken about, it's so well paced within the episode. So I think it's something where there's so much creativity there. And so for everybody out there who is thinking, oh, I want to start a podcast, and I think a lot of people feel like there's not maybe room for my idea, or it's been done before. And the great thing about podcasting is there's room for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. And everybody's own individual voice and idea has merit and has an audience, and it's there if you want to build it, which is really fun. And, frankly, why we're here. I think, that power of the voice is really important to us here at Podbean. And I want to ask you last, there's a lot of aspiring creators and podcasters who are looking to achieve success with their shows, particularly with sleep and relaxation podcasts. So what advice would you give aspiring podcast creators?
I would say come up with your own niche, something that you're passionate about, that you feel hasn't been done before, or maybe that you could do in a different way. And then I would say to get a really, really good mic. Don't start off with something that's not good, like I did. I made that mistake. I really regret it now. But yeah, start off with the right equipment. Take your time. Don't rush into anything. Build maybe 3 or 4 episodes to release before you launch your show. Be consistent. Show up for your people every week. I think that's very, very important, or every other week. And just keep plugging away and just believe that you can do it, because you can if you have the desire and the passion.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful and very true. I think we've talked about this in terms of strategies to launch your podcast on some other episodes we've had of Podbean's Podcasting Smarter podcast and live stream series here. Consistency is huge, right? Making sure that your audience knows, hey, on this day and this time of the week, I'm going to get a new episode. So making sure that you have that consistency with your listeners is so important. And like you said, making sure you're comfortable with your equipment, making sure you have the best equipment that is available to you. And sometimes there's budget restrictions. So I think that's really,
Right.
And if you're just starting out, you may not want to invest in something that's a little bit more expensive. You may just want to get your first few episodes out. So I think that happens for a lot of podcasts, and it's part of the journey. But yeah, I think that's really helpful. Like you said, banking episodes before you launch. You want to make sure you have a minimum number of episodes. That can be 4, that can be 6, that can be 10. So that when, you launch your podcast, there's not either you have content already out or there's not a pressure immediately to just produce, and you don't have a buffer of a few backup episodes. So that's really, really important as well. And, just making sure you stay engaged and that you love it, right? I think we all create podcasts and work in the industry because it's such an amazing creative outlet. And there's so many amazing voices telling incredible stories and sharing them. So it's been such a pleasure, Clara. Thank you so much for joining us here for this series. And for everyone out there, pop your questions in the chat. Of course, we'll make sure that they're answered. And it's just been such a pleasure. I think we get to interview a lot of different kinds of podcasters here, and to hear, from the sleep side, how the podcast is made, the intention behind it, the amount of work that goes into it, and your journey of creating it has just been so special. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm going to read our brief outro, and then we'll wrap up for today.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this live stream of Podbean's Storytelling Podcast Week and Podcasting Smarter Live series for our July live event, In Conversation with Clara Starr, Unveiling the Magic of Your Sleep Guru podcast, featuring Clara Starr of the Your Sleep Guru podcast. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Storytelling Podcast Week has live stream sessions like this one with top podcasters and storytellers from scripted fiction and nonfiction podcasts from across our world and our imaginations. We also have exclusive episodes on the Storytelling Podcast Week podcast. If you joined late or want to have another listen to this amazing podcaster and storyteller, you can replay this live stream on Podbean's YouTube channel and our Podcasting Smarter podcast. Storytelling Podcast Week is brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to over 640,000 podcasts. To start your podcast today, head over to podbean.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for next month's Storytelling Podcast Week live stream. Thanks so much for joining us, Clara.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.